On October 12th, 1972, the Carrasco International Airport in Montevideo, Uruguay, was filled with the kind of loud, chaotic energy that only belongs to the young. A group of amateur rugby players, members of the Old Christians Club, were boarding a chartered Uruguayan Air Force, Fairchild FH-227. They were headed to Santiago, Chile for an exhibition match. But to them, this was more than a sports trip. It was a celebration of friendship and the invincibility of their early 20s. They joked about the turboprop plane. They tossed rugby balls in the terminal, and they invited family and friends to fill the extra seats. There were 45 people on board in total, including the crew. As the engines began their rhythmic hum and the plane lifted off the tarmac, the atmosphere inside was one of pure, unadulterated joy. They were flying over the spine of South America, a range of mountains so vast and indifferent that it has swallowed civilizations whole. From 30,000 feet, the Andes look like a wrinkled white sheet, beautiful and serene. But beneath that beauty lies a jagged, oxygen-starved labyrinth, where the temperature can kill a man in minutes. The young men inside the Fairchild looked out the windows and laughed, unaware that the silent white giants below were already reaching out to claim them. The flight was supposed to be a simple hop over the mountains, but the weather had other plans. Strong headwinds and thick cloud cover forced the pilots to stay overnight in Mendoza, Argentina. The next day, October 13th, the weather hadn't improved much, but the pilots decided to push through. This was the first domino in a series of catastrophic errors. Navigating the Andes in 1971 was a matter of dead reckoning and radio beacons. The pilots, believing they had passed the Planchon Pass, turned the aircraft north towards Santiago. In reality, they were still deep within the high Cordillera, surrounded by peaks that rose higher than the plane's current altitude. As the Fairchild began its descent through the thick, milk-white fog, the pilots suddenly saw the clouds part. What they saw was not the green valleys of Chile, but a black vertical wall of stone and ice dead ahead. The cockpit erupted in a frantic struggle. The engine screamed as the pilots pulled back on the yoke, trying to claw for altitude. But the Fairchild was a heavy, underpowered beast in the thin mountain air. The physics of the impact were visceral and violent. The right wing clipped a mountain peak and was torn away, spinning backward and slicing through the tail section like a hot wire through wax. In an instant, the back of the plane was gone, taking several passengers with it into the abyss. Seconds later, the left wing vanished. What remained was the fuselage, a hollow metal tube hurtling toward a glacier at over 200 miles per hour. It didn't explode. Instead, it struck a steep, snow-covered slope and began to slide. It was a high-speed sled of aluminum and human flesh, screaming down the Glacier of Tears. The force of the deceleration was so immense that the seats tore from their floorbolts, piling into the front of the cabin and crushing those trapped in the middle. When the metal tube finally groaned to a halt in a snowbank, the silence that followed was more terrifying than the roar of the engines. Out of 45 souls, 12 died in the crash, or the moments immediately following. The survivors crawled out into a world where the air was too thin to breathe and the sun was reflecting off a blinding, endless white. The first 72 hours were a masterclass in desperation. As the sun set on that first day, the temperature plummeted to minus 35 degrees Celsius. The survivors were dressed for a spring day in Santiago, light blazers, cotton shirts, and loafers. They had no heavy coats, no gloves, and no mountain gear. To survive the night, they retreated into the remains of the fuselage. They used suitcases, scraps of plastic, and cargo netting to wall off the gaping hole where the tail had been, creating a cramped, foul-smelling sanctuary. Inside, the living huddled together, using the heat from each other's bodies to keep their hearts beating. Among them were Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, two young medical students. With no equipment, no medicine, and only the most basic knowledge, they became the architects of survival. They used shards of glass to perform rudimentary surgeries, straightened broken limbs with pieces of wood, and comforted the dying as the cold began to take its toll. By the third morning, 5 more had succumbed to their injuries. Every breath was a struggle. Every movement was an exhaustion of precious calories. As the days turned into a week, the survivors settled into a haunting routine. They looked to the sky every hour, expecting the roar of a rescue plane. They had painted a large cross on the roof of the fuselage using lipstick found in the luggage, hoping a satellite or a high-altitude scout would see them. On the 11th day, they were huddled around a small transistor radio. They had managed to get working. They listened through the static to a news broadcast from Montevideo. The voice was clear. The search for Flight 571 had been officially called off. The authorities had deemed the area unsurvivable and decided to wait until the spring thaw to recover the bodies. This was the moment the miracle truly began, though it felt like a death sentence. The psychological shift was profound. They were no longer the rescued in waiting. They were ghosts. They realized that they were already dead to the world, and if they wanted to return to the land of the living, they would have to do the impossible. They would have to find a way to fuel their bodies in a place where nothing grew and nothing lived. This brought them to the edge of the ultimate taboo. For days, they had shared a single chocolate bar between 8 people, or a cap full of wine. They were starving. Their bodies were beginning to consume their own muscle tissue. They were becoming skeletal, their skin turning a translucent gray. They discussed it first in whispers, then in a communal meeting that lasted for hours. The bodies of their friends and family lay just outside the plane, preserved perfectly by the mountain ice. To eat them was a thought that caused many to vomit, but the logic of survival was cold and undeniable. They reached a Pact of Life. They looked at one another and made a solemn vow. If I die, you have my permission to use my body so that you can live to tell our story. It was not an act of desecration. It was a supreme act of communion and love. They were the first generation of their families to face such a choice, and they chose life. With shaking hands and tears in their eyes, they began the process. It gave them the protein they needed to stand, to think, and to eventually plan their escape. But the mountains weren't finished with them. On the 17th day, as they slept huddled in the fuselage, a low rumble began in the peaks above. Within seconds, a massive avalanche struck the plane, filling the interior with a mountain of suffocating heavy snow. They were buried alive inside their only shelter. 8 people were killed instantly, smothered in their sleep. The survivors were trapped in a dark, airless tomb beneath the snow for 3 days. They had to poke a hole through the ceiling with a pole just to keep from suffocating. In that darkness, trapped with the bodies of those who had just died, the remaining 16 survivors reached the nadir of their existence. Yet even here, they did not give up. They dug themselves out, clawing through the snow until they reached the surface. only to find a world that was even more hostile than before. The plain was now a grave, but it was also their fortress. They spent the next several weeks recovering, knowing that the only way out was to climb. By December, the snow began to melt slightly, and the expeditionaries, those deemed the strongest, began to train. Nando Parrado, who had lost his mother and sister in the crash, and Roberto Canessa emerged as the leaders of the final trek. They knew they had to go west, toward Chile. On December 12th, 60 days after the crash, Parrado, Canessa, and Vizintin set out. They were wearing layers upon layers of clothes and carrying a sleeping bag they had fashioned from the plane's insulation. They began to climb the massive mountain wall to the west, believing the green valleys were just on the other side. Instead, after 3 days of agonizing ascent, they reached the summit of a 15,000-foot peak and looked out. There was no valley. There was only a sea of mountains, thousands of white peaks stretching to the horizon. It was a sight that should have broken them. Vizintin was sent back to the plain to conserve rations, while Parrado and Canessa decided to push on. "We may be walking to our deaths," Parrado told Canessa, "but I would rather die walking than wait for death in the plain." The next 10 days were a blur of hallucination-inducing exhaustion. They walked until their feet were bloody stumps. They slept on narrow ledges, shivering under the stars. Their skin was burnt black by the high-altitude sun, and their eyes were hollow pits. Canessa was suffering from severe dysentery, but Parrado literally pulled him along. On the 9th day, the landscape began to change. The snow gave way to grey rock, then to moss, and finally, they saw a blade of grass. They followed a river down the mountain, their hearts pounding as the air grew thicker and warmer. On the evening of the 10th day, across a rushing river, they saw a man on horseback. Sergio Catalan, a Chilean arriero, saw 2 ragged skeletal figures waving frantically. He couldn't hear them over the roar of the water, so he threw a stone wrapped in paper and a pencil across the river. Parrado wrote the message that would shock the world. "I come from a plain that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. When the helicopters finally arrived at the crash site on December 22nd and 23rd, the rescuers couldn't believe their eyes. Out of the white desolation emerged 16 men, looking like survivors of a concentration camp, but with the spirits of giants. The news of their survival, and the subsequent revelation of how they had stayed alive, ignited a global firestorm. Some called it a miracle, others a tragedy, and a few were quick to judge the methods of their survival. But for the families in Montevideo, it was simply the return of the dead. The 16 survivors had not just survived a plane crash. They had survived the very limit of what it means to be human. They returned to a world that could never fully understand what they had seen or what they had done. They had lived in a place where God felt both very close and utterly absent. The story of Flight 571 remains a testament to the fact that the human will is the most powerful force on earth. No amount of ice, no height of mountain, and no depth of despair can permanently bury the truth that life, in all its messy, agonizing glory, always seeks the light. The ground in the Andes is now quiet, marked by a simple cross and a pile of stones. But the echoes of those 72 days remain a haunting, beautiful hymn to the power of the Pact of Life.